Remembering the 500 years of Anabaptist history. If you would like details on the upcoming lectures, there are a few more of these flyers in the back there. I'll just highlight that next week we'll hear from Elwood Yoder here at Weavers with the title of Farmers in Search of Land, Renewal, and Religious Freedom. So we'll be hearing about the 1600s tonight, 1700s next week. The week after that, we'll be back here, and then for the final lecture, we'll be over at the seminary. If I didn't introduce myself, my name is Caleb Schrockhurst. It's been a real privilege to work with Elwood Yoder and some fabulous historians putting this series together. I will briefly introduce Dr. Sprunger here. I'll pray for the evening, and we'll get going. And we will have time for Q&A at the end of the lecture. So, for those of you who don't know her, Dr. Mary Sprunger has taught history at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg for more than 30 years. She attended Bethel College in Kansas and the University of Illinois for her master's and PhD work. She's published numerous articles, mostly focusing on Amsterdam Mennonites, with special emphasis on the intersection of social, economic, and religious history in the 16th and 17th centuries. Mary and her husband Rashid are the parents of two young adult children who I went to youth group with at Parkview Mennonite Church. And in May, Mary will be co-leading a special EMU alumni and friends tour to Europe for the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism called Radical Reformation at 500. So let's pray together and then we'll get started. Pray with me. Dear God, we come together this evening looking for you, looking for renewal, how you would guide us into the next 500 years as one piece of your children and of your church. May we learn and be inspired from the witness of the great cloud of witnesses who have gone before. Be with Mary as she shares. Be with us as we listen and receive. In Jesus' name, amen. Join me in welcoming Dr. Sprunger.
Thanks, Caleb. Well, thank you for that introduction, Caleb, and good evening, everybody. I'm honored to be a part of this series commemorating the 500th anniversary of Anabaptist origins. It's especially gratifying to see a former student, Caleb, use his considerable gifts as a co-organizer of this series, and thank you, Elwood, for working so hard to make this happen. I also want to thank John Roth, who started off this series last week, for setting up my presentation so nicely. He emphasized how the way we practice Anabaptism is always evolving, determined in large part by our current contexts. Last year, out in the plains of Canada and the U.S., including my childhood home of Kansas, Mennonites recognized another big anniversary. It was 150 years since the migrations from the Russian Empire. One tour guide explained, the Russian Mennonites had a love affair with the soil and joked that they seemed to have thought that God was a farmer too. Agriculture also dominated, of course, the experience of those Anabaptist migrants who came much earlier and also later than 1874. And as we'll be hearing about, it sounds like next week, Mennonites migrating from Switzerland, the Alsace, and the Palatinate in the 18th and 19th centuries became farmers in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and eventually points north, west, and south. Now, North American Mennonites have seen themselves as a farming people. This idea persisted long past the time when most Mennonites made a living in agriculture. Many Mennonites in the U.S. and Canada are already the third or fourth generation off of the farm. All three of my Mennonite grandparents grew up on farms, but moved to town. One grandfather became an upholsterer in a furniture factory, while my other grandparents owned a golf course. Statistics collected 20 years ago on a sample of members of Mennonite Church USA showed that while only 8% were actually making a living on agriculture, 40% had grown up on farms. Now, I imagine that number would be quite a bit lower today, but it's not surprising that North American Mennonites have taken an agricultural orientation as normative, especially when it comes to their history or to the past. This is despite the fact that Anabaptist origins had a strong urban component in Zurich and other cities in Germany and the Low Countries like Augsburg, Strasbourg, Antwerp, Münster, and Amsterdam. However, when persecution became especially severe, there was a rural turn in some regions. And the Anabaptists, who eventually migrated to North America, came mostly from rural areas. So there has been this pretty strong agricultural orientation in North America. But in the mid-20th century, some Mennonites in Canada and the US began moving into towns and cities. And at this point, some sociologists and theologians celebrated agriculture as part of denominational identity, and even placed it at the very core of what it means to be a faithful Mennonite. Living in homogeneous rural communities where business, education, mutual aid, and social relationships were informed by the way of the cross was the best chance to preserve Anabaptist principles. In other words, the ideal for this rural community movement was a setting where most of your daily life played out in Mennonite institutions and businesses with fellow church members. Think Park View half a century ago. A much more recent advocate for countercultural Anabaptist revival through rural renewal, S. Roy Kaufman, just 3 years ago, in 2022, observed a global agrarian character of Anabaptism and wrote, "We carry in our Anabaptist heritage a precious inheritance of both faith and agrarian wisdom. That agrarian wisdom shaped and strengthened the theological perspectives we have come to identify as Anabaptist." This strong association of Anabaptism with farming would have come as a great surprise to Dutch Mennonites of the 16th and 17th centuries and into the present day. They might wonder how their urban reality came to be so marginalized in popular conceptions of Anabaptist history and identity, especially since it was Mennonites in the towns and cities of the Netherlands who greatly shaped core elements of the tradition, from the Dordrecht Confession, still used by old orders today, to the Martyrs Mirror. It was urbanites who had the intellectual tools and social and political capital to advocate for their persecuted fellow Anabaptists in Switzerland and the Palatinate, and who raised large sums of money to assist in migrations to America and to help Mennonites in the Danzig or Gdansk area left destitute from warfare and flooding. While Kaufman asserted Anabaptism was primarily a lived faith, a faith embodied in agrarian cultures, this was not true of Northern Europe. While Menno Simons did come out of rural Friesland, he traveled around to many urban congregations. And in fact, we find that only 3% of arrested and convicted Dutch Anabaptists were farmers. After all, they lived in an urban society. By 1525, the province of Holland had a 44% urbanization rate, and this is going to grow to about 61% by 1675. And for purposes of comparison, the US does not reach 50% urbanization until 1920, so 2.5 centuries after the Dutch. In the last third of the first century of Anabaptism, an authentic faith was alive and well in the city. And any students of mine would have expected a timeline. Timelines are very useful for getting across some information quickly. And I've put on this timeline the first 100 years of Anabaptism, and you'll see part of that is in the 17th century. So the earliest Anabaptists who could live securely under permanent religious toleration with few restrictions were in the Dutch Republic, which is today the Netherlands, from about 1580 onward. The newly formed Dutch Republic, after gaining de facto independence from Spanish Habsburg rule, underwent a massive economic expansion and developed institutions to facilitate this so-called economic miracle, like banking and a stock exchange. Prosperity led to a golden age of culture with painters like Rembrandt. It was a good place to be a Mennonite, or really, practically anybody for that matter. And I'm going to return to this timeline in a bit. I've got it interspersed with my slides, so you don't need to jot everything down and make sure that you've got it all. Now, to illustrate this era, I want to tell you about some average Mennonite individuals in the early 1600s who were well integrated into civic life. It's very common when discussing Mennonites in the Dutch Golden Age. Oops. Now I'm missing the slide I need here. Let me see. Sorry, it seems like two. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. Got out of order there. All right, I want to tell you about some average individuals. Now, usually people are highlighting famous people and their cultural achievements when they talk about Dutch Mennonites. This is the so-called great man approach to Dutch Mennonite history. It is important to do that because it shows a people who are immersed in society and culture, which is in stark contrast to most other Anabaptist groups in the 17th century. And you see, I'm doing it here too. I worked some in. Here's some more. But in my own research and writing, I've been more interested in trying to get the larger picture of the Mennonite population as a whole, not just the ones who ended up on paintings or currency or as famous authors and inventors. To do this requires written documents, and I need manuscript records in order to document that. But these kinds of sources about Mennonites only become numerous enough by the early 1600s to allow me to identify many individuals and how they related to their social setting. Prior to this, there just aren't enough surviving records to document the lives of average Mennonites. Now, I'll go back to my timeline. Oops. And you can see there in red, Mennonite records available around 1600. And they're still a little sparse then, but they then get better. So we can only start to look at a broader cross-section of what Mennonites were doing once we have several kinds of ongoing records, and historians call these serial records, such as systematic account books, minutes of a congregation that include baptism lists, and on the civic side, marriage records, burial records, wills, business contracts, and so on. So rather than just pick some interesting folks to talk about, I am going to use examples drawn from an unconventional source. These are notebooks from a charitable raffle or lottery. And I'm going to introduce a handful of Mennonites who participated in this lottery. The lottery itself isn't important for our purposes, but I'm using this as a way to illustrate how they were deeply involved in civic life. And then I'm going to use some of these Mennonites as my sample, if you will, the examples that I talk about to show different aspects of lived faith in an early modern city. Their stories show an early willingness to engage with civic events and broader culture rather than maintain a stance of separation from the world that was more typical in rural areas still under persecution. And I'm going to be focusing on the early 1600s to show the remarkable integration of Mennonites into Dutch society shortly after the end of persecution. In the first decade of Anabaptism, back in Switzerland and regions near there, failure to achieve government support for their reforms and subsequent persecution led to an emphasis on separation and apoliticism. And outside of Northern Europe, a kind of a ruralization of Anabaptism. In the same way, I better go back to my timeline, the advent of religious toleration in about 1580 there, with the creation of the Dutch Republic, led the urban Mennonites on a path of social, economic, and cultural engagement. And so you can see that my lottery is from 1606. So 2 generations after Menno Simon's death and 1 generation after religious toleration in Holland, Jan Jans Vreeland visited the house of Jelmer Sieverts near the harbor in Amsterdam and bought 21 lottery tickets. The lottery was to raise money for a municipal alms home for the aged, basically an old people's home in nearby Haarlem. Later, over the course of several months, lots would be drawn each day to great fanfare, with the lucky few winning some cash prizes, and then there were some smaller prizes like a silver spoon. It was like a raffle, like I said. Each lot or lottery ticket cost the equivalent of about a third of a day's wage for a skilled laborer. So these weren't that insignificant in terms of cost. People who bought tickets offered up a rhyme or saying that the collector recorded along with the purchase, which was then used for identification. And these are kind of fun because they can provide clues maybe to a person's identity. Freeland's rhyme was, "I've helped bring nutmeg from East India and I'm willing to pay for the winning lot with a shilling." Now, I didn't say it was great poetry. And that's these are all my translations. So, his father, Jan Petersen Vreeland, was one of the founding investors for a sum of 600 guilders in the Dutch East India Company 4 years earlier. Another lottery collector across town, in a newer part of the city, was Lambert Cornelissen Schouten, from a very rich brewing family in a town called Weesp. That was about 10 miles southeast of Amsterdam. But he also maintained a house in the city for business. In later years, he would be appointed burgomaster or mayor 17 times for annual terms in that city. While only Calvinists could hold public office in Amsterdam, in some of the smaller towns where Mennonites might be the most prominent residents, wealth trumped minority religious affiliation, and Anabaptists overcame theological hesitation about serving in government. I mean, essentially, they kind of had to step up. Among those people that Schouten sold lots to were immigrants from Antwerp and Flanders is a Dutch-speaking region of Belgium. These were religious and economic refugees, such as Albert Verspeck. He had been an Anabaptist leader who had traveled around among various churches at great personal risk, moving back and forth throughout the entire Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium, during that time of persecution. And he was a merchant of some kind. So he bought double the typical number of tickets, which I thought was interesting. The locksmith, Matthias Jans Keizer, used a rhyme that reveals a materialistic but maybe realistic view of life. Save and scrimp if you want to have worth, for those who become old with little might well regret living. This is something to consider as I approach retirement. Other Flemish immigrants purchased lottery tickets from different collectors. Gilbert de Flinnis, one of Amsterdam's earliest manufacturers of silk fabric, purchased 14 lots with this appeal: "May God protect him and his family from misfortune always." In his lottery rhyme, prominent goldsmith Jacques Martsen noted that he had wandered like a pilgrim, kind of hinting at his own migration from Antwerp. On a street in the heart of the city, the New Dijk, which is today a kind of a touristy pedestrian zone, another collector, Hendrik Jans Fossian, or in it Fossian, which means in the house called the Little Fox, which was like an address to give your house name. He sold lots to friends, family, neighbors, and an assortment of out-of-town clientele from coastal areas in Holland and Friesland, people who were in Amsterdam on business in the harbor city. One entry was especially poignant. It included lots purchased for the unborn at the home of his pregnant daughter, Hendrikje Hendriksvoss, the wife of a sailmaker. The accompanying saying was, "Where love is the foundation, peace is splendid." It sounds kind of like something Menno Simons might have written, I thought. Another buyer in Voss's collection log captured the spirit of the Dutch Republic. Be they Protestant, Mennonite, or Catholic, each greedily fills his own money chest. And this rhymes nicely in Dutch, but it didn't work in translation. Now, this was not an original rhyme on the part of this purchaser, because variations of this saying circulated around in the Netherlands at this time. It shows that religious pluralism, or many different religions coexisting together, was taken for granted, and it poked fun at the Dutch dedication to profit-making above anything else, which was a common characteristic at the time, as these things always are, probably partially true. Now, I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about religious pluralism, because that's a big theme for this lecture. So you can see here that Reformed Protestants or Calvinists made up maybe about 1/3 of the population of the Netherlands. Nevertheless, they were the privileged religion of the country, and so they were like recognized as having more sway than other religions. Roman Catholics probably made up another 1/3 or so. And then Mennonites, it's difficult to say for sure. In some places, at different times, they might have made up as much as about 20%, or 1/5. But in Amsterdam, in the 1600s, generally, I've calculated that they might have made up about 3 to 5% of the population. And Amsterdam does become a very big city, as we'll see. Now, this famous masterpiece by Rembrandt, called in English Syndics, or Dignitaries of the Cloth Guild, which hangs in the Rijksmuseum today, used to be, well known because it was on cigar boxes. But lately, it's become very common to use this as a symbol of religious pluralism and toleration in the Dutch Republic. And there's a term that scholars have been using, and that's everyday ecumenism. Mingling on a daily basis with people of different faiths as you go about your work, in your neighborhood, and so on. And sometimes even in your own family, or I should say often in your own family. The reason this has become a symbol of this pluralism is that these 5 merchants, I know you see 6 people there, but the guy in the back is a servant. So the 5 merchants in the front are all people who monitor the quality of a certain kind of wool cloth in Amsterdam. So they've got this important position. 2 are Catholics, 1 is Reformed, 1 is a kind of Calvinist who believes in free will, which in Holland was called a remonstrant, and 1 is a Mennonite. But you can't really tell from looking who or which is which. This is the Mennonite. And I think it's worth mentioning that he's actually from one of the more conservative branches. There were a variety of different Mennonite groups in Amsterdam. But here he is in the thick of things. He's a prominent enough merchant to be included in this important role. So this everyday ecumenism is quite unusual in Europe at this time. Oops. So, just like my lottery collectors and buyers, which, by the way, that was taking place 50 years before this painting, they also embodied everyday ecumenism. They were all involved in local civic and social life, as our participation in the lottery shows. They all rubbed shoulders with people of different social classes, religions, and places of origin in their neighborhoods, and as they went about their daily business in Amsterdam, which was the hub of a growing commercial empire. All of them took advantage of the rapid economic expansion in the young Dutch Republic, whose founding principles guaranteed freedom of conscience. And all of them were active members in the same Waterlander Mennonite congregation, which had just acquired a new meeting house in 1605, known as By the Tower. Now, on this bird's eye map, I've highlighted in yellow where the different Reformed or Calvinist churches were. And then in this red circle, where the Mennonite church I'm talking about was. I could also have colored in on this map a Lutheran church, several other Mennonite churches, and a Jewish synagogue. This shows a little bit more detail here. And the name By the Tower just refers to a tower that was located nearby. Now, since Calvinists controlled religious policy, the large meeting house that they worshiped in had to be concealed behind row houses on both sides so as not to attract attention as a rival church. And so in the red circle, you'll see the blue roof. That's their meeting house and their buildings. But on either side are the red roofed canal houses that hid where the church was. Now, this wasn't secret. Everybody knew where it was. The fact of this church was not a secret, but it just simply had to not look prominent or look like a church. Inside, it looked like this. Now, if some of you have been to Amsterdam and visited the hidden Mennonite church there, the Singelkerk, this is not that church. This church was torn down, I think already 2 centuries ago. But it looks kind of similar. Okay. Now, back to our timeline. All right, so these Mennonites who worshiped in this church and who were participating in our lottery, while deeply connected to their minority faith, they were nevertheless thoroughly urban and well integrated into the bustling cosmopolitan society where they lived. They joined in the project of creating the Golden Age, when the tiny republic dominated European trade and created an empire that reached to Asia and America. Their world was very different from those Mennonites still facing severe persecution in Switzerland. And you can see on the timeline that the last Anabaptist execution or martyrdom was in 1614, and that took place in Zurich. So 8 years after this lottery. Especially in the province of Holland, Mennonites of all stripes adapted to a setting that scholars have recently called the most commercialized, the most urbanized, the most literate, and richest place anywhere in Europe and probably the world, with the standard of living rising dramatically after 1580. Now, I'm going to show how living in Amsterdam affected several of these lottery participants and their progeny. And I'm going to highlight this list of characteristics. Now, we've already talked about the first two. Well, I didn't use that term, the world's first modern economy. That's from that's a book title. I talked about the economic miracle, but kind of amounts to the same thing. They just had a really great economy for about 100 years. And religious pluralism we've already covered. So we'll be talking about immigration, upward mobility, income and status inequality, and being immersed in culture. Okay, and for each of these, I'm going to be using an example from my lottery. Okay, so first, immigration. It's no coincidence that few of my sample were born in Amsterdam. One of the most striking features of the city was the high number of immigrants. Gerrit Mak has written, "The phenomenon of immigration, in short, dominated to a considerable extent the life and mentality of 17th century Amsterdam. The population of the city more than tripled from about 1570 to 1620 to over 100,000 people. Most of this due to immigration, both from Dutch provinces and also Germany, Scandinavia, England, and especially Flanders. In the early 1600s, about 1/3 of those living in Amsterdam had been born in what today is Belgium. It's a lot of the population. Many Mennonites were part of this migration, such as Martzen, de Vlinnes, Kaiser, and Verspeck, escaping ongoing religious persecution in the Spanish Netherlands. They were not able to gain independence from Spain, and so that continued to be Catholic and under Spanish Habsburg control. And then they also were suffering economic malaise from the war that was ongoing. And so this influx of newcomers brought with them different customs, modes of dress, skills, ideas, and theology. And this contributed to the dynamism of society. It's important to note that much of this immigration was not a process of urbanization, but rather moving from one city to another city. And our example of Jacques Martzen shows that. He came from Antwerp, which at the time was a much more important commercial city. This was right before the economic miracle. And he became a citizen of Amsterdam in 1578, just 1 month prior to the time that Amsterdam came under Protestant government. Citizenship allowed Martzen entry into the Goldsmiths Guild. And already by 1583, he was an officer in this guild and far wealthier than the other 14 goldsmiths in the city. We know this from some tax records. His early religious background is unknown, but by the time of the lottery, he was the head of the guild and involved with the Waterlanders and would soon become a deacon. Being a Mennonite was not a barrier to guild participation. Jacques' two sons, Hermanus and Gideon, both followed their father into the profession and the church. Hermanus had an affair that led to scandal and a child born out of wedlock, which brought him into a disciplinary process in the church. He had to confess his sin of extramarital sex to the entire congregation. But apparently his repentance was convincing enough. There were a lot of tears, and people were very moved, so his honor was restored. I don't know what happened to the child or the mother. I don't know their names even. Like his father, he eventually became prominent in the Goldsmiths Guild. And from what I can tell, the Martzen brothers took their faith seriously. In a notary act, we find them attesting with Haramana Varheit, truthfulness based on their own honor rather than swear an oath. Anabaptists pretty much everywhere prohibited swearing oaths, which were necessary in Europe at this time to gain the privilege of citizenship and conduct some official business. In the Netherlands, an alternative had been worked out early on, so this did not hinder participation in society or the economy. Okay, upward mobility is our next category. Another aspect of city life, in addition to geographic mobility, was upward mobility. And many of the wealthiest Mennonites were wholesale merchants who shipped goods from northern to southern Europe. In the late 16th century, becoming a prosperous merchant was often a sense of upward mobility. This is this new economic expansion, and if you get into it early enough, there's a lot of chance for improving your economic status. Lottery collector Jelmer Sieverts is an example of this. He was born and raised on the Frisian island of Terschelling, and his was a family of skippers or ship's captains. They weren't farmers. And he went into the same business. And so when he moves to Amsterdam and we see him getting married there in 1591, he was a ship's captain on the Baltic Sea route, trading up into the North Sea. Soon after his move to Amsterdam, he gave up seafaring to become a merchant, rope maker, shipbuilder, and investor in both real estate and ships. Now, instead of navigating ships himself, he hired them to move goods from Baltic seaports, to move goods between these Baltic seaports and France or Portugal. He also owned some ships or parts of ships. It's like owning a share in a company today, to own a ship's part. Now, there were a lot of dangers at sea besides shipwrecks and fires and so on. Pirates and privateers were very dangerous and a big threat. Privateers are like pirates, but they work under commission of a government that's giving them sort of legal go ahead to rob other ships, enemy ships. That's a warfare, a wartime strategy. And then there was also periods of warfare where you had just warships going around. So there were a lot of dangers. And one of Jelmer's own ships was indeed captured by pirates while en route from Danzig to Portugal. The lost ship was eventually returned to Holland, recaptured by a Dutch squadron out to reclaim ships and enslaved Europeans held captive on the Barbary coast of North Africa. And by the way, this image is taken from a book that we have in the Menno Simons Historical Library, and it might even be by Jan Lauken. At least some of the prints in this book about Barbary pirates are by Jan Lauken, who did the Martyrs Mirror prints. Here are just where some of the dangers at sea could be. You can have privateers, pirates. The Barbary coast there is north of Morocco and Algeria. That's sort of what we're talking about. But even going up into the Baltic Sea, depending on what was going on at the time internationally, you could be attacked. And so one of the things you could do was to take protection from going with a convoy, a fleet of ships that would be protected by some warships. Now, this whole business of armed ships was very troubling to Mennonites. Jelmer's ships must have been armed with cannons because it would have been foolhardy to enter dangerous waters without protection, although I don't have exact documentation of that. But churches tried to establish policies against owning ships with cannon. Less clear is the stance toward freighting goods on armed ships. If you're just hiring a ship to move things around, maybe that was okay. At least infractions about this don't show up in the disciplinary records, the aptly named ban book. The elders did come down hard on those who worked on armed ships, either during wartime or on Dutch and West India Company ships. And these were usually poor sailors. You don't become a sailor unless you're desperate or forced into it. It's a terrible job. Many people never returned, especially from the long-haul journeys to Asia, for example. But we find the elders disciplining poor sailors, who are on these warships, but also steermen and captains could be disciplined by the church if they refused to give up their commissions. Transporting goods on armed ships or being part of a convoy fleet protected by warships seems to have been accepted, or was possibly a case of don't ask, don't tell. Okay, another aspect of city life was extreme income inequality, and along with that went social inequality. And this carried over into churches, including Mennonite ones, in a way I think that we don't experience as often here, for example, in the United States, where churches tend to be relatively homogeneous in terms of economic and social status. The story of Gilbert de Flinis and his descendants will help to illustrate what this meant in the church. Now, this is kind of a long story, but it's going to show several different aspects, so just bear with me. So Gilbert was one of a number of immigrants from the southern Netherlands responsible for making silk production an important part of the Golden Age economy. De Flinis moved his family in 1583 from Antwerp to Amsterdam, benefiting from that recent Protestant turn there, which happened in Amsterdam in 1578, so just a few years afterwards. So he got several benefits. First, the relief that his family must have felt from being in a place where there was religious tolerance. But also, he was able to benefit in another way. He set up his silk business in the weaving workshop of a former convent, the St. Maria Cloister. The nuns of this convent had been driven out of the city by the new Calvinist government, who then also confiscated the building and then apparently rented it out to de Flinis. So it was very convenient. Many other Anabaptist Flemish refugees came in the next few years, bringing with them knowledge of how to produce a range of silk textiles like satin, damask, and velvet. Gilbert did well in his new city, and his children were able to prosper, even as, or maybe because, they continued to move in Mennonite circles that provided strong family or kinship networks. And by the way, this is the only portrait I have of any of these lottery people I'm talking about, but it's I think it's the son. It's either Gilbert de Flinis number 2 or Gilbert de Flinis number 3. I don't quite have that worked out. But Gilbert's son and namesake, probably this guy, followed him into the textile and silk business. At age 21, in 1610, the second Gilbert de Flinis set up a company with some partners to print various kinds of fabrics. He was also able to improve his rank in society by his marriage to Anna Cornelis van Groteval. She was from a patrician family. Now, when we talk about patricians, what we mean is like a kind of the top rung of society, and then it was from these families that officials in city government were drawn. Mennonites, because they couldn't serve in government, didn't really make it into that very top tier unless they abandoned their Mennonite identity and membership. There are some like children of Mennonites who get into that top tier. So this improved his status, and interestingly, she joins the church. 6 years later, both Gilbert and Anna were baptized in the Waterlander Church. Now a church member, Gilbert was able to borrow a very large sum of money, 2,500 guilders, from the church coffers. This was common practice in the Waterlander Church. This way, the church's money earned interest rather than sitting idle in a money chest. And for Gilbert and other leading church members, taking out loans from the church was a great source of extra capital. By 1642, he and his son, the third Gilbert de Flinis, managed 70 silk looms in the city. This was a number matched or surpassed by only a few other merchants, including Waterlander father and son duo, the preacher Cornelis Claes Onslow and his son Garbant Onslow, who oversaw an astonishing 225 looms. This allows me to get another famous painting in here, because this is Cornelis Claes Onslow, the father with all of the looms. And this is he and his wife, Altje Gerrit Schouten, who, as we're going to see, is the niece of one of our lottery collectors. And he was a very wealthy cloth merchant. His father had been a wealthy cloth merchant. His father was a deacon, and Cornelis is a preacher. These merchant manufacturers were in charge of production from start to finish, from importing the raw materials to selling the fine fabric, either domestically or abroad. So, for example, de Flinis and some partners had a contract with the East India Company to buy all of a certain kind of raw silk it imported to the Netherlands from Asia. Countless other Mennonites were involved in the silk, wool, and linen textile industries, including those who actually did the labor of spinning, winding, dyeing, and weaving. Those were not the wealthy merchants. They just sort of oversaw things. Some of these skilled and unskilled workers were also from Flanders, like the velvet weaver Jelles Size, who was from Antwerp, but he was in a much lower social tier than the merchants. When in 1643 Jelles joined the church via baptism, he worked for the young Gilbert de Flinis, I'm not sure which one that was, and he lived in a narrow alley. This slide will show you why you would rather live on a canal than in a narrow alley. You can imagine that the alley would be rather dark, dank, probably have a terrible stench because, you don't have good sewers and such. Much nicer to be on a canal. That just is to illustrate sort of, income inequality. Now, Jelles and his wife had gotten married the year before in the French-speaking Reformed church, but then they quickly joined the Mennonites. I don't know why. Maybe he was evangelized through his work. Eventually, he and his wife were living in one of the Mennonite almshouses and receiving support from the deacons. And if you got onto the Mennonite Congregational Welfare or Poor Relief, there was a complete package that you might be eligible for. Housing, what do I have up here? Housing, food, petty cash, household linens, clothing, money for your children to get some education or basic education or job training, those kinds of things, and then special requests as well, medical help and burial, if you needed that at the end. So, maybe they had this plan to benefit materially by joining the Mennonites? We really don't know. Yellis wasn't maybe the most upstanding church member, and maybe he wasn't a very steady worker either. At one point, in a hiatus from the Mennonites, he and his wife fled town to escape creditors and baptize their children Reformed. But then they come back, so. Now, I'm using this example because it highlights this sort of strange economic and social inequality in the church. It seems strange to us that an employee of a fellow church member and deacon wouldn't be making a living wage and would have to supplement his income with welfare that his employer was in charge of doling out. But Gilbert and his deacon associates did not strive for egalitarianism within the church or society. They accepted a stratified society where the rich would give generously to help out the needy. At the time of the lottery, there were many members of the church who would not have had money to spare on tickets. So now I'm jumping back to 1606. And there were at least 80 individuals or households receiving regular financial assistance at that time. And they had names like Treinschiff and Cologne, Mädchen in the Ritter Street, Gerrit the Cobbler, Little Hans, and Deaf Jannetje. I'm just naming them because these people usually get left out of the, kind of image of the Dutch Mennonites. And these two were urban Mennonites. And you can see they don't even get last names in the account books. By mid-17th century, the number supported by the church had risen to over 150 households, so almost double. But the church had probably grown as well. But I've estimated that it's maybe 10 to 15% of the total church membership, and that the wealthy would have also been about 10 to 15%. It's hard to know for sure because of incomplete records. Now, managing the extensive system of congregational welfare or poor relief fell to a board of deacons, which from the lottery sample included at different times Jacques Martsen, Gilbert de Flinnis No. 2, two grandchildren of Gilbert de Flinnis No. 1, the father of Jan Jans Freeland, Hendrikje Hendricks Voss, and the grandson of Jelmer Siefert. So all of those people connected to our lottery served in the diaconate. Hendrikje Hendricks Voss, whom we met as the pregnant daughter of the collector in the Little Fox, would eventually be a deaconess. There were 3 deaconesses at any given time, and you had to be a widow. They oversaw things like bed sheets and clothing. They had to ask the deacons for money, so it's not like a great, kind of example of women's rights or anything. But I just want to note that participation in society at large was not a barrier to church leadership. In fact, it was practically a requirement for deacons who managed thousands of guilders and kept track of the many poor households. Besides bookkeeping skills, and I should mention literacy because that's not taken for granted here, even though it was a highly literate society, deacons needed to be men who understood business and successfully handled money. And to do that in urban society required extensive networks of information and finance that stretched well beyond fellow church members. Those prosperous Mennonites who did not serve as deacons gave regular donations to the church, such as Jelmer Siefert's, and usually included large bequests for the congregation's poor in their wills. Now, I see I'm running out of time here, but I want to hit a few more things. Another thing that we find is access to a favorable capital-rich marriage network. And I've kind of characterized this as an elite Mennonite oligarchy. In order to preserve or improve status and maintain honor, which were all necessary to do business at this time, marriage partners had to be from a similar or even better rank. The rich married the rich. There was almost no question of marrying someone from a lower rung of society, even if they were from the same congregation. That wouldn't override being middle class, if you will, or poor. And it would be better to marry somebody of a different faith, probably, than to marry somebody poor. Sad to say. The prominent families intermarried, consolidating capital and forming this kind of patrician class among Mennonites, like an oligarchy from which church leaders, especially deacons, were chosen. Even our small sample provides examples. And here you see my crude attempt at diagramming the corrections. And yes, I did use a Sharpie. I'm not going to go through the connections I tried to make here, but at the top are 4 of the lottery participants, and then the red circles indicate marriages and their progeny, either their children or grandchildren or whatever. It's just to give you an overall impression. These folks were all intermarried. Especially everybody wanted to get in on the Schoutens. There were 3 brothers, very wealthy. Schouten's niece, Altje Gerrit Schouten, was the one who married that preacher, Cornelis Claes Onslow. And their daughter, Hillegonde Onslow, married the grandson of Jelmer Sieverts. Jelmer's over here on the end, and Hillegonde's over there married Stefan Schellinger. And he died, and then she married a reformed man and started to go to his church. She came under scrutiny from the Waterlander elders, but promised not to take communion there. Church policy encouraged marrying within the faith. Those who married outside, as it was called, to non-Mennonites were banned from communion for a time, although sometimes the spouses joined the church, as we saw with Gilbert de Flinnis number 2. And there's different examples where like wealthy women married to somebody outside of the church seems to have been still accepted in the fold, and especially for their ability to donate large sums of money. In the pluralistic Dutch Republic, denominational lines were very porous, with many non-members attending church services, sometimes receiving baptism in midlife and beyond. And we saw that with Gilbert and Anna. You know, Gilbert doesn't get baptized until 6 years after he marries. And there were a lot of people who simply weren't affiliated with any church. It kept you outside of the disciplinary restrictions, perhaps. Now, I'm only going to have a short amount of time to talk about some critiques. There were some contemporary critiques of this, what could be perhaps conceived of as a worldly lifestyle. Just really briefly, like from 4 confessions of faith that were written in the late 16th century and up to 1632, only one of them says anything about economic practice. And the concept of cologne, 1591, condemned usury and ostentatious clothing. And usury is interest, right? But maybe unreasonable interest. I don't know. Different interpretations of that. What's interesting is that the Waterlander deacons, they affirmed this confession of faith in 1601. And the very next year, we see them loaning money, a lot of money, 600 guilders, to a church member for 7% interest. So they weren't following this sort of thing that they had signed off on very well at all. Interestingly, the interest drops then through the first decade or so after this, like down to 6%, then 5%. And maybe they were getting their idea from Calvin, who said that really interest should be topped at 5%, otherwise it was usury. Peter Peterson was an author who rejected justifications of wealth and called for radical countercultural discipleship. I don't have time to say more about that right now. Then, of course, we've got the martyr books. You know, the Martyrs Mirror was not the first Dutch martyr book. It's based on some things that Hans de Ries wrote, and he based his on some earlier work as well. But Hans de Ries was a herring merchant in another city, so he's not from Amsterdam, he's from Alkmaar. And he wouldn't loan or borrow money because he thought that was, you know, greedy and you shouldn't be making interest off of money. And he was an amateur alchemist, and he provided free medical services. I put medical in quotations because I'm not sure exactly, you know, how skilled he was. But he provided free medical care for the poor. So he tried to, in his 1631 martyr book, he, you know, does bring up the wealth of the Dutch Mennonites, and both he and Van Bracht from the Martyrs Mirror, you know, compare the Anabaptist martyrs who clung to neither life nor material goods with the folks in the 17th century in the Netherlands. And what about current critique? Just really quickly, Like all heirs to Anabaptism, these Mennonites were flawed. Most Dutch Mennonites were unapologetic capitalists. They participated in colonialism as investors in the exploitative and militaristic Dutch East and West India companies. Now, when these started, like 1602, when the East India Company starts, these are exciting new ventures, and it took a while for the sinister implications to become clear, I think. In 1602, the idea was to get to buy directly from traders in Asia, so you didn't have to go through these various middlemen. But things do turn sour pretty early on. Eventually, Indonesia would come completely under Dutch rule until independence in 1949. That's just one example of Dutch colonialism. I have a map here of the Dutch Empire. You see the Netherlands is that tiny green blip in Europe. The yellow bits come in later, that's 19th century, but you can see they've got some territories in Asia, South Africa, some trading posts there in the west coast of Africa, and in South America, the Caribbean, and so on. Also what becomes New York. But anyway, so that's one thing. And then, of course, the Dutch also become involved in the terrible transatlantic slave trade in the very late 16th century, but especially mid-1600s and beyond. And it's been hard to find specific examples of Mennonites profiting from transporting enslaved Africans to the Americans, although we always knew there must be some. Now, sobering new research, just 2 years old or so, by Ruth Lombour, has been able to identify 14 Mennonites profiting from the transatlantic slave trade in the mid-17th century, including the son of Jelmer Sieverts van der Schelling, Sievert, and the daughter-in-law of Hendrik Jafas, Altjefelten. So these are both people connected to my original sample. At the same time, Piet Visser has shown that some of the few early Dutch critiques came from Mennonite voices, and prominent abolitionists in the 18th and 19th centuries were Mennonite. Now, I only have a minute to talk about, I guess the slide wasn't up when it should have been. So we've got these 14 Mennonites involved in the slave trade. I only have a minute to talk about immersion in culture, because I tend to do social and economic history. But historian Michael Dreiger has decried the overemphasis on 16th century Anabaptist origins that for centuries prevented analysis of what happened in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. And while I look primarily at economics, Dreiger looked at book production and used that as a marker of cultural engagement and Mennonite activity. Doing this has led to his very bold conclusion that urban Dutch Mennonites were the largest, most publicly active, and significant community that debated and attempted to define Mennonite identity for about 10 generations, from 1550 to 1800. You can read about it in his very substantial and significant article that appeared in Mennonite Quarterly Review in 2023. This evening, I've introduced a number of issues that Mennonites faced in a wealthy, cosmopolitan harbor city. And a few of them were akin to issues that concerned Mennonites in the late 20th century. In 1990, North American sociologists, theologians, and historians gathered to discuss the effects that urbanization was having on the church. And topics included things like individualism, ethnic identity, assimilation, modernization, secularization. Away from the isolation of the agricultural community, what would happen to members in constant contact with larger society? Leo Dreiger and Leland Harder, two sociologists, observed, the urban pluralist environment constantly pushes us to rethink and reconstruct our theology previously dominated by the less changing rural environment and now influenced by the fast-moving urban settings. And note that this is 1990. The internet, I don't know, was it around yet? At least it was in its infancy. Smartphones, not a thing. So, the pace of change has really increased. It was hard to imagine how Anabaptist churches could survive in the onslaught of new ideas and diverse peoples while navigating worldly institutions. I'm arguing, however, that it was only hard to imagine because of the strong emphasis on Mennonite agrarianism throughout history, with the accompanying ideal of separation. And this tended to permeate history and sociology, at least in North America. Ongoing concerns about oath swearing and weapons in 17th century Amsterdam show that the church, even in a city so dependent on international trade, with members who lived their lives in a bustling urban space, nevertheless continued to demand ethical commitments at odds with the dominant society. The wealthy, as we've seen, devoted a great deal of their time and money caring for needier members. They remembered the Anabaptist martyrs while also engaging with new and exciting intellectual and religious impulses. In so doing, they reframed what it meant to be Anabaptist, just as we continually do in our own setting. Let's broaden our popular conception of true Anabaptism to include urban Mennonites, both past and present, in cities around the world, such as Bogota, Nairobi, Taipei, Philadelphia, or Amsterdam. Thank you. I'm afraid we're...
Thank you very much, Dr. Sprunger. One other thank you I meant to do at the beginning is to just thank the Shenandoah Mennonite historians. If you would like to access recordings of these lectures, if you go to that website, Shenandoah Mennonite historians, you can access them there. Also thank them for their financial support. We do have time for a couple questions. I'll come around with the mic.
I recently read Ian Baruma's biography of Spinoza, and there are frequent references there to the Mennonites that he hung out with. And from the description of them, they seem very unorthodox theologically.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I guess, how characteristic that was, but also whether that was also a result of urbanization or related to it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Spinoza is the kind of a Jewish skeptic a philosopher in Amsterdam, and yeah, there are a number of Mennonite connections to him. There's a whole group of Mennonites who, in the second half of the 17th century, are engaging in sort of associations and groups that are quite rationalistic in their thinking, but some are also pietistic. There's a group called the Collegians and so on, and so some of these people are unconventional. I would say, that doesn't encompass all of the Mennonites, of course. Some were more into that than others, and some controversies about too much rationalism and things like that lead to some schism. So I would say it's certainly a result of urbanization in that you're mingling with people of different beliefs, different ideas. There's these intellectual cross currents going on. Mennonites in the late 1600s and 1700s get into science in a big way, and the Enlightenment, those kinds of things. So that looks extremely unorthodox, and even the Dutch Mennonites today, some would have some ideas that wouldn't maybe be too popular in, MC USA. So, yeah.
Other questions?
As you're talking about this range, I'm thinking about the PBS series, The Miniaturist, which I suspect was in this same period of the Golden Age, and you had the religion, whatever the religion was. Maybe those were the Protestants.
I think they were Reformed, yeah.
Yeah. So, but I can see the same ideas of the high ethics and the same high cultural and interaction in that story, and their interaction too with the poor people. So
yeah. That's a.
Would you say that would maybe kind of give some insight into the period? I mean, a fairly accurate insight into the period, given all the fiction in there and whatever.
Yeah, I think so. It certainly that's the setting, right? That's what these Mennonites were living like for the most part, yeah.
And how the Mennonites were living was probably pretty typical with the other religious groups.
Well, that's just it, right. So how different were they is the big question, and in many ways not that different. Like, for example, I've studied their poor relief system a lot, and it was extremely generous, but it was pretty similar to what other churches were doing. One of the big differences is I think they always had a really, hefty poor chest. They had a lot of money, but perhaps more so than some of the other churches. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, one or two more questions.
Paul Roth. Perhaps I'm the sole non-Mennonite in this gathering. But I have a question about who maintained the core faith and values of the Mennonites during this time of Golden Age. Was it the agrarian folk who lived much lower level, lower status, and interacted more with the land and the people with them? Or who was it who kept the faith and the belief in Jesus and the way of Jesus? Or did that not happen? Was everyone so acculturated to the gaining more wealth and using that in a strategized way of taking care of some poor people in some way that's managed by the wealthy? Can you speak to that at all?
Well, yeah, that's kind of a loaded question because, let's see, you mentioned something about who kept sort of the true faith, so that assumes that there is sort of a normative ideal. These Mennonites would have viewed themselves as very faithful people. They were, some of them are very pious. Might not have looked like, for example, the Mennonites in Switzerland or the Palatinate or 1950s USA. But they were also keeping what they thought a tradition was. It's not going to be an exact reproduction of what the early 16th century Anabaptists were doing. But I'm not sure I'm willing to quite go where you were going with that question. Now, the Waterlander branch of Mennonites that I've been using as my example are called the more liberal branch, but they merged in 1668 with a group called the Flemish, who contributed to the Dordrecht Confession of 1632. Well, the Flemish were doing all of the same thing as well. I mean, they were very wealthy, engaged in all kinds of cultural things, painters and art collecting and colonialism and all of that. So, yeah. Now, of course, I have nothing against farmers or agriculture, and there certainly were, that's an important part of things. But I wouldn't say that they are the movers and shakers. I wouldn't say they are the ones keeping that true faith alive. I mean, like my example of the martyr books are, the martyr authors, they're not farmers, they're merchants living in smaller cities. So you raise a really great point, but that we could debate that quite a while, I think.
Can you say just how much the Dutch Mennonites helped the Swiss as they were being persecuted, say, in the next couple centuries, in getting up the Rhine, in supporting them once they got up there, and sending them to America and so on?
Well, I can't say just how much they did, just to say that, as you point out, they helped a lot. I mean, already in the mid 1600s, they're writing letters and getting their government to try to pressure Swiss authorities to reduce the persecution. And then they establish a fund for foreign aid, essentially, to help out Mennonites. Also, as I said, from war-torn and flooded regions in what today is Poland, but then also helping with the migrations. I can't put numbers to it. I haven't actually even studied that, specifically myself. But right, it's an important part of the story.
Okay, I think we should, well, Harvey,
Harvey,
I'll
one
give you
more.
the last question.
Just wondering what some of your personal observations would be with regard to comparing our era today, Mennonites in North America who are also living in a sort of golden age in a way, prosperity-wise and so forth. What should we learn from this part of your story?
Well, I prefer to stick to history, and I suspect you've been making your own observations as we go along. I'll just say that Leo Dreger, one of the sociologists I mentioned, I had the pleasure of meeting him. He's from Winnipeg, and of course there was a lot more urbanization actually even going on in Canada than in the United States at that time. And we had it was something called the Amsterdam Summer University. It was a special course. This was in 1992, I believe. That was kind of a continuing education course on Dutch Mennonites, and it was called From Martyr to Muppie. Do you guys remember what muppies are, right? The mobily upward, people. Anyway, so he was always trying to get it, he was like, oh, this is great, this is just like what's happening in Winnipeg, and so on. Yeah, I might just leave it there. I mean, I would say, for example, we maybe don't appear to be as ostentatious and extravagant in our lifestyles as some of these wealthy Mennonites were, but, we have far more consumer goods than any of them would have ever had. Many of us, spend our money on all kinds of things, travel, hybrid cars or even all electric cars and all kinds of things like that. So I hate to kind of, judge and compare. Other than to say that we're certainly, I don't think, it's very helpful to look back and be hypercritical. The lessons for today are maybe less clear other than survival, The Dutch aren't really celebrating 500 years of Anabaptism in a big way because it doesn't come there until 1530. But hopefully in 2030, there'll still be Mennonites there celebrating 500 years of an Anabaptist tradition. It might look different from the way it looks in many places, but they're still around.
Join me in thanking Dr. Sprunger.
Thank you.
Okay, hope to see many of you back here next Thursday. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.